I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
How? How do you manage every time to pick open a wound to a fresher hell?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My IQ is the highest among all Reddit.
That's not saying much.
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
There's something beyond the direct physical observable world. You can't quantify, you can't put under a microscope. If you don't want to, immediately adopt the Muslim understanding of that, that's fine. You'll get there eventually.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
It's not just witchcraft, it's nerds. You guys are nerds. My parents didn't let me read Harry Potter, not because of the demonic elements. They just didn't want me to be a nerd.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
I've always deemed myself an evil capitalist.
Because that's how they get you. They get in your head. They start making you ask funny questions. And before you know it, bang, you're a liberal.
I thought it was a matter of record.
Social credit deducted.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This episode of the AntiSocial Network is brought to you by North Arrow Coffee Company, a veteran-owned company that donates 15% of its proceeds to pro-life groups like Soundview Pregnancy Services and Compass Care Crisis Pregnancy Center in Buffalo, New York. Support the AntiSocial Network and use code AntiSocial10 at checkout to receive 10% off your next purchase of coffee and other coffee-related products. Thank you very much. This week we are joined by Paul Krause, the editor-in-chief of the VoegelinView, and I'm tempted to ironically call him the former wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings, but Google tells me that's a different Paul Krause. So
safety.
So he knows what I'm talking about. When did you know that? Like, is that something you've known for a long time, or is that just?
Well, yes. I mean, in another life, I did play football, so that was always an interesting thing. And I was in fact a safety and defensive back, but I obviously did not have the same sort of illustrious career that he had.
Like, not all of us can be Tom Brady, so we'll have to just kind of make our own way, I guess. So So for people who don't know who you are, who haven't seen your YouTube channel, tell people about what you do with the VoegelinView and what you just do in general online.
Yeah, so as Tyler said, my name is Paul Krause. I'm the editor-in-chief of VoegelinView, graduate of Yale, and I also studied with Roger Scruton, who I'm sure some of your audience might be familiar with. And I also run my own YouTube channel, as Tyler said, largely posting just lectures on the humanities, generally philosophy, literature, some religious studies, theology, theological content, often paired with just beautiful works of art, or at least artwork that I would consider beautiful, since beauty and aesthetics is a very important topic for me, naturally, as somebody who's gone through philosophy and also studied with Roger. Now, I know not everybody gets to have the kind of humanities education that I received, especially at prestigious institutions and with fairly notable individuals who made their life and career out of it. So it's really a way for me to give back to others who are on that journey, because I remember what that journey was like without too much support and side material. So hopefully anybody that comes across my content will find useful information as they're going along in their own educational journey. I got to know some of the members of the Eric Voegelin Society when I was a grad student at Yale. Then they tapped me to be editor-in-chief. And when that was happening, VoegelinView was really a sort of academic blog for scholars and members of the professoriate, as well as graduate students pursuing work largely in philosophy, political philosophy. But given by the time I was asked to be editor-in-chief, I sort of transitioned and reinvented myself as a literary critic and a literary classicist. I told the board, and they agreed with me, that I was going to transform it into sort of a public humanities journal, as I like to say, more intellectual online version of, say, the New Yorker, the New Republic, or the Claremont Review of books. And so that's what it's largely become now. And we've been experiencing wonderful readership growth, a lot of networking and partnerships with a number of publishers. I know I gave you a book to review a couple months ago, which you very kindly undertook for us and submitted on the topic of aesthetics and music. So that's largely what I've been doing. You know, I thought at a time I was going to go pursue a doctorate, because what else is somebody who really wants to be a writer going to do when they're also sort of intellectual and interested in academic subjects? But when I was at Yale, I learned that I didn't need a doctorate to become a writer. I got picked up at various journals and newspapers when I was there, as well as with some of my professorial connections. Ended up in the wonderful world of writing, and so public writing is what I've sort of been doing ever since.
And it's so far I'm gonna mispronounce Voegelin wrong for the entire podcast. And I'm
It's
not
okay. most people pronounce his name wrong, anyways.
Yeah, I mean for your work on the review, it's impressive so far. I'm glad that it's starting to it's picking up more, because the internet needs more more upstarts attempts at creating new literary journals that are appealing to the younger generation. Especially in light of the fact that no one in our generation has read anything beyond Harry Potter, and even that's a bit of a wash nowadays. So it's getting people kind of more educated and aware and thinking about these things it's good. And I do appreciate the fact that you brought me on to do that review. It was a little bit it's been a while since I delved into music theory. I used to sing, and so jumping into that book again, it was like, putting on a hat you haven't worn in a decade. So it was an interesting experience to go back and do that.
Yeah, no, well, I'm glad to hear that you appreciate a lot of the changes, because one of the things I've learned as somebody who's written on contract and who also writes on freelance, when I was picked up and offered a contract at the Imaginative Conservative, which is incidentally the way I ended up getting to know you, because you had actually linked me in, I believe, a Twitter post or something, because you had written an essay. I think it was probably for Geeks Under Grace, one of the places that you have a prominent relationship with. You had cited me and then tagged me on Twitter because you were taking stuff that I had written about from the Song of Roland in that piece. And so I'm sympathetic to a lot of the younger generation. So I'm a millennial. I'm at the tail end of the millennial generation, so I suppose I'm still young as well. So when you're on contract, you sort of have the liberty to be able to write on what you want. And so as somebody who was educated in economics, history, philosophy, and then biblical studies and theology at Yale, and then philosophy again, so I do not have a formal, quote-unquote, formal background in literature, which is the main reason why I still love literature. If you end up studying English literature for 4 years at college, you lose your love for it because you get indoctrinated in awful political zeitgeist theories. So when you're on contract, you obviously have the liberty to do stuff. So that's what happened. I was like, well, I've always loved literature. I was an AP English student back in high school. And having a contract with the Imaginative Conservative gave me an outlet to explore literature through philosophical, aesthetic, and theological and mythological lenses, which was obviously the content and the substance of what I was doing in grad school. But seeing that so many of the supposedly prominent publications online today that are perhaps friendly to Christian and nominally conservative intellectual and educational interests, they really don't give any room for substantial literary criticism. So I felt, agreeing with T.S. Eliot, that it's the moderate and the more modestly read journals that are always the hub for literary criticism. That was one of the things I wanted to immediately embrace when I became the editor-in-chief at VoegelinView, because a lot of the times, and you might sympathize with this, there is in fact a lot of young talent who has a love for literature, who would love to do literary criticism and write substantial essays, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words, exploring a great work of literature, but then they don't know where to go, or they don't have anybody they know to publish it. I'm not one to throw dirt and digs at other places, so I won't name them. But I have found it very interesting that certain very prominent New York-based conservative publications have always rejected my literary criticism pieces. But yet, when I fork it over to, say, a Catholic cultural journal like New Oxford Review or a ecumenical cultural journal like Touchstone, I've literally not changed a single thing in the essay, and then they accept it and publish it. Unfortunately, I'm not complaining about that, since obviously there's a great love and appreciation for being accepted there. But sometimes you feel like you might just be preaching to the choir, you know. Well, who are the people in the world today who tend to take an elevated view of art, aesthetics, culture, and literature? It tends to be a certain segment of the Catholic and the Anglican crowds who have that sort of aesthetic and literary and cultural tradition behind them. Yet your mainstream so-called conservative or Christian publications, they're just not interested in publishing a 5,000-word essay on Leo Tolstoy. You know, it's to their loss, but it's to our gain.
It is. Well, the only downside for us is that suddenly your 5,000-word essay, or my 5,000-word essay on Virgil, now it's not getting paid for. Now it's just it's bringing in volunteer donations to Geeks Under Grace, which I can't complain about because they've given me basically complete creative freedom, and that's the reason I've written for them for 6 years. But
it's a great thing to have.
Yeah. And being able to just, basically do whatever I want, even when it annoys my editors. Just having that ability to write something crazy like that. But it would be nice to get to a point where where some of these literary journals that actually have resources and finance to back up a lot of what they're doing, kind of back up a lot of these younger writers, because I can't tell you how many people my age, myself among them, that really could use an extra $500 check for writing, an extremely long essay on Virgil or something of that kind of sort. But I also recognize that, Arc Digital's not going to make a ton of money off of my 5,000-word Virgil essay. So you kind of have to take it to, like what you're saying, like in my case, I'd probably take it to North American Anglican or First Things or something like that, because those are the ones that they're going to seriously take a look at your essay and be like, hey, this is, extensive commentary on XYZ that no one else wants, and we don't have that many people submitting to us, so it's like there's almost that pragmatic level to it too, where even they have the cultural desire, but they also have that, we have to fill a quota, so people need to help us. So it definitely helps that that these smaller websites want to reach out to people that are a little bit more out there and willing to do these very strange self-reflection pieces like what you and I would write.
Yeah, and it's having been on contract and then having become an editor-in-chief, I have garnered a greater appreciation for what editors go through, because obviously I've become one now, and you get access to all the important data, analytic data, what's being read, what the finances are. I'm actually hopeful with the growth of with VoegelinView. So we've grown over 40% readership over the past year. Obviously, you might be aware I've opened up the journal to poetry submissions. I'm about to open us up to creative fiction, short fiction, flash fiction, really in a mold to rechristen the entire identity as a sort of public arts and cultural journal with a humanities and humanistic focus. And I am actually hoping that as that goes on, improvements in the financial department will come down the road. So at some later date, ideally, we can give back in, even if it's in a modest way. As I like to say, it's different because I do have a background in economics as part of my bachelor's degree, which is generally not what the professoriate is familiar with. So there are some limitations when you take over what was originally a niche academic blog for an academic society. But no, what you touched on is something that I'm cognizant of as well, since, being on contract is a wonderful thing because you are receiving a monthly honorarium based on that contract. but then also knowing that so many places, as you so eloquently stated, so many of these smaller journals that are in fact interested in substantial literary criticism. I mean, this is just a handful of people who, at night after their day job is done, is trying to make an impact in digital space. And I'm also hopeful that in digital networking, which is in some sense what the two of us are doing right now, that further ties can be strengthened. I am a big believer in sort of cultural and humanistic ecumenism. I mean, I think it's rather annoying. I'm just going to speak freely here. I think it's rather annoying that so many, especially Christians, are involved in petty disputes with each other online, when in fact they have so much more in common than what they have in difference. And yet there's never any sort of substantial working together because, oh, well, this guy's not a Thomist and this guy's an Anglican and that guy's a Baptist. I think it's rather sad that is often the state of digital online Christian content creation. And one of the big goals I have at VoegelinView, which God is not on the masthead, and neither is the Catholic Church on the masthead. But most of the professors and a lot of the writers tend to be Catholic. But a good friend of mine I met at Yale, he's done several reviews for us. He also wrote a fantastic review of a Cotton Mather Reader, which was recently published by Yale University Press. So naturally, the both of us being alumni, was able to get Yale University Press to send him the book for free, and he wrote it. But I would like to see a sort of broadened expansion. Another friend of mine who I made an assistant editor is Orthodox, member of the Eastern Orthodox Communion, because again, we often have so many interests. You will often find Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, and even those who are wandering but friendly to Christianity. We all have a lot of the same interests. We're interested in the classics, we're interested in Plato, we're interested in Aristotle, we're interested in great literature, poetry, John Milton, John Donne, T.S. Eliot, etc. And I think it's imperative in the cultural contours that we're currently living in that we actually try to come together in some substantive way and give back to the next generation and generations after that the nourishment of the soul that comes from intellectual endeavors.
One shudders to imagine what would happen if all the Baptist churches in the South opened up art stipends for like pan-Christian, investment. Just like, it's like, hey, you're an artist and you're actually like a good artist and you want to make Christian art. Here's $5,000. What can you do with that? Like that, it'd be interesting if we could actually get some level of ecumenicalism going off of that. Because at the moment, it just seems that they just pour it into God's Not Dead 4, and then whatever ensues. So, which I don't want to pick on them on our Baptist friends too much, but the results speak for themselves. No one has watched those movies in 10 years, and they haven't made a dent. So you'd be having some level of unity on that front would be very fruitful, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I would think so too. And what you said is I think very much correct, because you'll find many Baptists as well as members of other Christian denominations. Everybody loves T.S. Eliot. He's about as ecumenical as you can get. He's widely read, and it's the same thing, for instance, with John Milton. Now, I mean, we could go on and get into a discussion, not here, but obviously one could discuss the, if we're being nice, the very heterodox views of theology that John Milton had personally. But it's undeniable that a substantial amount of his poetry is so deeply soul-stirring that everybody from low church evangelicals to high church Anglicans to even now Catholics have a certain appreciation for the style, the beauty, the wit, and the charm of Milton. And Bishop Barron talks about this, I think, in an indirect way when he talks about the importance of beauty. It wasn't long ago that reading beautiful literature and beautiful poetry was often a catalyst for conversion for so many people. And to just ignore that today, I think, is to the great detriment of Christians of every denomination and stripe.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit, because that was originally, I mean, before we kind of went into the politics of of publishing, a lot of what I wanted to discuss with you is specifically on the philosophy and beauty and love, because that's something you kind of go back to constantly in your Twitter stuff, where you encourage people to read, basically every day you're saying, go read Plato, go read Homer, go read some essential work of classical philosophy. And but you tend to tie it all back to those two themes of love and beauty, and a lot of times it's a little bit perplexing. I use the example, I think of one of your threads about earlier this year about why the Iliad is really a poem of love, and nowadays when you say that, you tend to think of the Song of Achilles, stuff, when people they claim. So what is it? What do you mean when you say that something like that is about love and beauty?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, of course, because it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. So I've recently completed a first draft manuscript which is a sort of a literary commentary on the Iliad, where I am trying to explain how this is really a poem of love. I wouldn't say this thesis is unique to me. There have been classicists in the past who have said very much the same thing. Now, I want to preface, obviously, when one is dealing with the classics, because I've said it before too online, that language should never be a barrier for somebody to enter the literature of another culture and another language. I think classicists especially, who are sticklers on, well, if you don't know Greek, then you never actually read Plato. I disagree completely with that sentiment. I do think there's a certain cohort among our cultural guardians who deliberately want to try to keep the so-called unwashed masses out of the club. I'm the exact opposite. You should, if you don't know Greek, read them in English, because the world of Homer, the world of Plato, is fantastic and wonderful and so moving. But at the same time, I do understand, and I agree with the position that some knowledge of the language in question is very beneficial. So, for instance, when you deal with Homer and the Iliad, and how it's really a song of metamorphic love rather than war, some knowledge of Greek is very useful. So Christians are often told a half-truth about how the word love, agape, entered our lexicon. And that's through the Alexandrian translators of the Bible, in producing the Septuagint, created the word agape for the love that they were seeking to express as a form of mercy, compassion, and charity that they found in reading the scriptures. That is only half true, because the root cognate that was taken for agape, the actual letters there, AJAPE, come from Homer, and they come from Homer's Iliad. Homer doesn't use that abbreviated word agape, so that is the condensed version that the Alexandrian translators gave to the Christian world. But that root is found in Homer's Iliad. It's also found in the Odyssey. If I remember correctly, I think there are 9 or 10 instances that Homer uses the root agape in the Iliad. And all of them are in moments of loving kindness throughout. Two of the most notable examples in which these are brought up is when Patroclus comes to heal his wounded comrade Eurypylus, who has the arrow wound in his thigh. Now, if you know the Iliad well, this is actually a great act of agency on Patroclus's part, because Achilles is still sitting out of the war, and he's told his entire group, the Myrmidons, which includes Patroclus, not to help the Greeks until Agamemnon is sort of humbled and begs Achilles' return in the war. Another one of the famous uses that Homer uses for agape is when Priam is seeking entry into the tent of Achilles after Achilles has gone into his rage and he's killed Lycaon and Hector and so many of the other Trojans, the god Hermes arrives to guide Priam into the tent of Achilles, and Hermes introduces himself and uses that word as he expresses his love for humanity, which is going to bring Priam into the tent of Achilles. And you also look at the beginning of the text. There's that famous word mene, which is the word that's generally translated as wrath or rage in so many of the English translations. Now, that word is very specific because there are two different words that are used for wrath and rage in the Homeric lexicon. And mene is used exclusively for the divines. So that's what gives Achilles his sort of divine status. It's found in his rage. But at the end of the poem, he lets go of that rage. He embraces love to where he lifts up Priam as a friend in forgiveness and returns the body of Hector to Priam. Peter Arensdorf, who, much like me, has a background in philosophy and political philosophy, wrote a book several years back published by, if I remember, I believe it's a University of Chicago Press, and it's called Homer on the Gods and Human Virtue. And he makes this case, too, that the story is really about the humanization of Achilles, his drift away from this divine rage into human friendship and love, which consummates itself in that beautiful and touching moment in the tent when, if you're following a pattern of learning exposited by Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, who are very big on imagery, right? The scene of Priam supplicating at the knee of Achilles was actually a very brutal scene that we had just witnessed a book or two earlier, when Lycaon, one of the Trojan princes and sons of Priam, completely unarmed, defenseless, throws himself at the feet of Achilles, begging for his life. And that is not what you see. Achilles comes in and just brutally butchers him. And of course, that's not what you have happen at the end of the Iliad. Now, Homer and all the other Greek readers and listeners knew how the story was supposed to end. We still had the Trojan horse. We were still going to get the death of Priam, the death of Achilles. But of course, that's not what Homer gave us. He gave us a work that ends on a note of peace brought forth by an act of loving forgiveness between two enemies.
1 second. My microphone turned off for a second there. What do you think that points to in a greater sense? I mean, obviously you talked about beauty being something of a conversion tool or pointing to God for some people, but what do you think that in something like that points to in Homer? Like, what do you think that suggests about, what is something we should take away from that?
Well, I think it's important when you look at Homer, especially if you take, for instance, if you're reading from Christian eyes, if you're influenced by a hermeneutic from the church fathers, but also I think most famously in modern times, somebody like C.S. Lewis, right? That you can see this as a preparation for the gospel message of love and forgiveness. Because even if it's in a somewhat minimal form, that message of love and forgiveness, especially towards an enemy, and how it brings peace and serenity into the world, is part and parcel the gospel message. And we do find that, even if it's in some sort of a shadowy form in Homer. I think Homer in his Greek context, and this is what so many of the classicists point out, and I would agree with them, that Homer really does begin a humanistic revolution, especially when you read him in dialogue with his counterpart, Hesiod. Hesiod's Theogony is a giant poem all about divine rage and wrath. The divine rage of the gods, the Titans, and the triumph of Zeus, right? His opening invocation is to the muses of Helicon to sing the praise of Zeus. Homer shifts that dramatically. We're now singing in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I'll just say here, I would agree with the classicists who say that there are two different Homers. I won't belabor that point, but if you know Greek, the Homer of the Iliad is probably very clearly different than the Homer of the Odyssey. I don't really care, though, for questions of Homeric authorship because I think it detracts and distracts from the thematic message of what we're reading, which is, I would consider, so much more important than figuring out whether or not these are two different poets. But Homer's shift of consciousness to focus on human beings and the love found in human beings, I think, is very important. And that is really the ultimate message of Homer. I think it's also the message of the Odyssey as well, that love is found in a courageous act of free will among humans, principally extended to one another. And it moves in the Iliad, right? You get these acts of filial love seen by Hector. You get this act of compassionate and healing love from Patroclus. And then it finally manifests itself in the most beautiful form possible at the end of the poem, when Achilles lifts up Priam, his avowed enemy, who he has just declared that he was going to kill. And they lift each other up in a moment of embrace, love, and he returns the body of Hector to Priam. And that also underscores what St. Thomas Aquinas says about love, that love is the, quote, unitive force. And of course, that's exactly what we see at the end of Homer. Two enemies who have been going at each other's throats now for the last few books, and Achilles declaring that he's going to wipe the seed of Priam off the earth. He has every moment to do it, but the love that he experiences in that moment actually brings the two together. And then they have a moment of forgiveness, and he returns the body of Hector, and then he bestows on his own act of free will temporary peace, so that the Trojans can bury the body of Hector. And incidentally, that is exactly where Homer ends the entire narrative. He doesn't care to give us the rest of the story that he and all the other Greeks knew. He gives us a story ending on that note of peace brought forth by an act of forgiveness extended to an enemy. And I think that's one of the most touching, most beautiful, loving scenes in all of classical literature.
I'll briefly add to that by pointing out that the Odyssey and the Aeneid do the very similar things as well. I mean, and Chesterton probably says it better than I can, that you without the Odyssey, you don't have this deep literary depiction of the longing for home, or without the Aeneid, you don't have this this entire story that essentially presages the entirety of Roman civilization itself. But we're kind of running short on time, so I kind of want to just end on one more question. How is this something that average people can engage with? Like, what do you encourage most people who struggle with poetry and philosophy or feel intimidated by it to do?
Yeah, well, I would say, one of the first things that you should begin to understand is you shouldn't really worry about how much you can read. Sometimes you feel like, oh, I need to read, 50 pages of Thomas Aquinas or 50 pages of Plato. If you only read just a few pages, if that's all you're able to take in, great things often start small. So I would say, if you're trying to get into great poetry, if you're trying to get into philosophy, maybe just read one sonnet a day. Just read one sonnet. There's no reason you need to try to read 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different poems. Just read one sonnet. And as you're beginning your journey into poetry, just make that part of your regular habit. And I tell people at conferences, I tell students who are interested in great literature, you could make reading actually part of your spiritual discipline. As you're perhaps reading the Psalms in the morning, why don't you read a religious poet in the morning? Just read one poem in the morning alongside the Psalms and make it John Donne, make it George Herbert, and it'll eventually become part of your regular spiritual life and your reading practice. And then that will seep through and impact the rest of your maturation and growth as a reader. And then you'll eventually probably see that you're just a great connoisseur of poetry, and you will discover the truly wonderful and remarkable tradition of English religious, theological, and metaphysical poetry. It really is perhaps the greatest tradition in the entire world in that regard. So many great poets in this tradition of metaphysics and religion. But you could extend the same thing to great works of literature. Don't feel like you need to read all of Homer in a week. You know, maybe you only read one book of the Iliad a day. You know, you'll complete it in the course of a month. There's 20, 21, or 22 books, if I remember correctly. So just read one book a day. And I'm a big believer in using what we find in culture as a gateway into some of the great texts. So many of us probably saw the film Troy before we ever read Homer. And I'm sure, especially for those of us who are guys, we fell in love with Brad Pitt, and we really loved that film when we were teenagers. We thought it was amazing. But even though you see that Wolfgang Petersen's film is in some ways dramatically different from the Iliad, obviously the gods are much more prominent in Homer's poem and the gods are absent in the film adaptation. I actually still like the film adaptation because I think what Wolfgang Petersen did so brilliantly was he also understood that the Iliad is a love poem. And he made it about the love between Achilles and Briseis. And there's that very touching scene at the end that as he's dying and Briseis is with him, he says, "You gave me peace in a lifetime of war." And again, you have that theme, which is right there at the end of the Iliad, peace in the midst of war. And that's what it's all about. So if you happen to love certain films, use the films as a gateway into the literature. And also for philosophy, you know, it's really hard to understand philosophy if you don't begin where philosophy started. You know, if you have a certain love for modern philosophers, you really do need the building block with Plato. And again, maybe you only read one book of the Republic a day, or you say, I'm going to read one book of the Republic over the course of a week. Just start small, because that's the best way to enter what will ultimately become this great pilgrimage through art, literature, philosophy, and culture.
We're out of time, but I thank you so much, Paul, for coming on. He's on Twitter at Paul_J Krause, and he's the editor of VoegelinView. So, and he has a YouTube channel, so everyone should go check him out. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tyler.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cali, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.